Number 1.
At the beginning, investigators were very optimistic that John Doe would be quickly identified. However, no one came forward to report their child missing, and his description didn't match that of any existing missing child reports. In the hopes of generating leads, his death was broadcast throughout the country via police teletype, leading to visitors from 10 states traveling to Pennsylvania in an attempt to identify him. A request was soon sent out to residents of Philadelphia, child welfare agencies and other law enforcement groups, asking them to call in any information they may have regarding boys matching John Doe's description, who were known to have either recently disappeared or who were in the care of someone known to abuse them. Investigators also requested that the local media cover the case, resulting in the Philadelphia Inquirer printing 400,000 flyers that were distributed across the area and placed in gas and electricity bills. An article describing John Doe's scars was also printed in a pediatric journal. Despite the case receiving intensive coverage in Philadelphia and the Delaware Valley, the boy's identity remained a mystery. Police canvassed neighborhoods and checked with every hospital, orphanage and foster home in the area, but found every child was accounted for. When they tried to compare his fingerprints and footprints, they found he was not registered at any hospital or in any national database, leading some to believe he was born at home and never reported. It's important to note that a strand of long, brown hair was uncovered at the scene, which didn't belong to the boy. Police then turned their attention to the box the boy was found in, which once held a white bassinet. A serial number on it allowed investigators to trace the box to a penny store in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, located at 69th Street and Chestnut Street. It had been sold between December 5, 1956 and February 16, 1957 for $7.50. A search of records showed that only 12 were sold, and while police were able to track down 8 of the purchasers, the lead turned cold. The crime scene was combed by 270 police academy recruits, which resulted in 3 items of possible evidence to be uncovered: a royal corduroy blue cap, a tan child's scarf, and a handkerchief with the letter G in the corner. The cap, in particular, was of great interest to investigators as it appeared in excellent condition and featured the manufacturer's stamp in the lining, which read, "Robbins Bald Eagle Cap, 2603 South 7th Street, Philadelphia, PA." When they questioned the shop's owner, Hannah Robbins, they learned that it had been customized for the man who had bought it. According to Mrs. Robbins, he'd been between the ages of 26 and 30, with blonde hair and no identifiable accent. After purchasing the cap with cash, she never saw him again. Despite visiting over 100 stores in the area, investigators were unable to find anyone who recognized the cap or the boy. As they kept hitting dead ends in the investigation, a post-mortem photo of John Doe was distributed, showing him dressed and in a seating position. Eventually, John Doe was buried in a potter's field in Holmesburg, Pennsylvania, next to Mechanicsville and Dunk's Ferry Road. His tombstone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown child." Between 1957 and 1958, believing John Doe may have been passed for a female whilst alive, a forensic artist drew an image of him as a girl. However, this produced no new leads. Former medical examiner's office employee, Remington Bristow, felt a personal connection to the case and worked hard to find a resolution. In the hopes of coaxing the boy's parents out of hiding, he published a fake story in the local newspapers, claiming his death had been an accident and that his loved ones had been unable to afford a funeral. Unfortunately, this tactic was unsuccessful. Bristow also personally put up a $1,000 reward for information and traveled to Arizona and Texas in the pursuit for leads. He was known to carry a mask of John Doe's face in his briefcase. There was some speculation that John Doe had died as a result of drowning, given the water wrinkling on his skin, but police said his injuries didn't correlate with such a manner of death. The case was eventually featured on America's Most Wanted, and while numerous people called in, no leads resulted. In 1998, John Doe's remains were exhumed in order to extract maternal DNA for testing. This was taken from the enamel from one of his teeth. The DNA was sent to the University of North Texas and entered into both national and local databases. Unfortunately, it produced no hits. John Doe was reinterred in a grave marked America's Unknown Child in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. The cemetery donated the plot, while the son of the man who buried John Doe in 1957 donated the coffin, headstone and money for the funeral service. The service garnered significant public attention, and residents continued to keep the grave decorated with stuffed animals and flowers. On March 21, 2016, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a forensic facial reconstruction of John Doe and added his details to their database. In August 2018, the genetic genealogist who helped identify the Golden State Killer announced they would be using DNA profiling in order to try and identify the boy through familial DNA. Recently, the Vidic Society sent out an urgent request form asking those aged 55 and older to see if they recalled a boy by the name of Jonathan who went missing within a 40-mile radius of Philadelphia in 1957. It also asked former physicians to think back and try to remember if they'd treated the boy for a possible medical condition based on the scars that were present on his groin area and on his left ankle. Over the years, the case has been reopened and closed numerous times. While new tips continued to be called in and followed, investigators have shared that it's likely the person who murdered John Doe is deceased. There are numerous theories surrounding John Doe, many of which have been disproven on the basis of investigative measures and DNA testing. One of the most thoroughly researched theories in the case is that John Doe had been the child of a girl who lived at a foster home located 1.5 miles away from where the body had been found. This theory was one Remington Bristow heavily focused on, and he believed John Doe had been the son of Anna Marie Nicoletti, stepdaughter of Arthur Nicoletti, the man who ran the home. According to Bristow, Anna Marie, who is said to have been mentally challenged, had 4 children out of wedlock, 3 who had been stillborn, and the other who had died after being electrocuted in 1955 outside a supermarket. It's believed the boy's death was accidental and the result of the family not wanting word to get out that Anna Marie was an unwed mother. In 1960, Bristow contacted a New Jersey-based physic who told him to look for a house that matched the description of the foster home. When he later brought her to the dump site, she led him directly to the home. Later, upon attending an estate sale at the home, he discovered a bassinet that resembled the one sold at JCPenney, as well as blankets that looked similar to the one the boy had been found wrapped in. Investigators have looked at this angle numerous times over the years, but have found no evidence to support that the Nicolettis were involved in the boy's death. DNA testing done later proved that he was not Anna Marie's son. 2. Another prominent theory in the case is that he was a victim of human trafficking and suffered severe physical and sexual abuse. This came after a Cincinnati, Ohio-based psychiatrist contacted investigators after a patient by the name of either M, Mary, or Martha told her she wished to speak with them. According to M, her abusive mother had purchased John Doe from his parents when she was 11 years old, saying she distinctly recalled her mother handing his parents an envelope in exchange for the boy. After that, both he and she were subjected to years of sexual and physical abuse, which eventually resulted in his death. She shared that one evening, he threw up his dinner of baked beans, which led to him being beaten into a semi-conscious state. While his mother tried to clean him up in the bath, he died. In an attempt to conceal his death, M and her mother traveled to the Fox Chase neighborhood in Philadelphia. When they were preparing to remove his body from the trunk of the car, a motorist pulled over, thinking they'd gotten a flat tire. M had attempted to conceal the car's license plate, and upon her mother denying his request to help, the motorist drove away. After hearing this story, numerous investigators were convinced of its plausibility, as M touched upon aspects only investigators were aware of, including a 1957 statement from a man who claimed to have witnessed a mother and her child pulled over in the area around the time the boy was found. There was also the fact parts of his body were water wrinkled, which supported the idea he'd been bathed before his death. However, skepticism was abound, as a search of her home uncovered no evidence, and interviews with neighbors revealed that no such boy had been living at the home during that time period. Upon her name being released through a media outlet, M fled the country and police have yet to say where she relocated. 3. A third theory in the case is that John Doe may have been raised a girl. This is associated with the release of the 1957 sketch of him with long hair and is supported by his unusual haircut and the strands of hair found on his body. According to reports, his eyebrows also appeared to have been styled. 4. A theory that was quickly ruled out surrounded the possibility that John Doe was a Hungarian immigrant whose family came to the United States in the 1950s. This was seen as unlikely, as immigrants at the time were required to be vaccinated, and John Doe did not have a vaccination scar, and the boy he was believed to be was located with his family in North Carolina. 5. David Stout, author of The Boy in the Box, The Unsolved Case of America's Unknown Child, has theorized that John Doe's parents were likely poor, possibly carnival or migrant workers, who would have been able to travel without a paper trail. This theory is supported by the 1961 arrest of carnival workers Kenneth and Irene Dudley after their 7-year-old daughter was found deceased in a wooded area in Virginia, wrapped in a blanket with signs of abuse and malnutrition. Several of their children had also gone missing, with many having passed away as a result of neglect and abuse, but none of them were found to have been the unidentified boy. 6. Two authors have suggested that John Doe is the deceased brother of a man currently living in Memphis, Tennessee. After speaking to a Philadelphia resident, they learned of a family who had rented a home from him. They had sold their son and suddenly left the area not long after news of the murder of John Doe broke, leaving behind items that were seen as necessarily for everyday life. Philadelphia's former assistant medical examiner was questioned about this, and he noted that there were similarities between John Doe, his potential father and his potential brother, particularly in the nose, facial structure and the ears. He said these similarities alone were enough to warrant further testing. DNA from the man in Memphis was obtained in 2014, but investigators stated they needed more evidence in order to have it tested. This finally occurred in December 2017, which confirmed there was no familial connection. 7. A quickly ruled out theory was that John Doe was the son of a New Jersey-based trooper. However, when his wife was shown an image, she didn't believe him to be her son, who was later found with his father, watching TV and eating a sandwich. 8. Some have speculated that Frederick J. Beninis, the college student who discovered the body and reported it to police, was involved in John Doe's murder. While he voluntarily took a lie detector test and was cleared by investigators, proponents of this theory cite the unreliability of polygraph testing. 9. A final theory is that John Doe was Stephen Damman, a young boy who went missing from New Jersey on Halloween 1955. His mother, Marilyn Damman, had left her 2 children outside while she went into a grocery store, but when she returned, she found they were both missing. Her infant daughter, Pamela, was eventually discovered a block away, still in her pram, but Stephen was nowhere to be found. Given Stephen shared similarities with John Doe, his hair and eye color, age, and a matching scar on his chin, he was ruled out as being him, as he'd suffered a broken arm. DNA testing would later confirm this. Stephen has never been located.
Number 2.
The murders had taken place over 100 years ago, but the Jasmine story remains one of the greatest mysteries and unsolved murder cases within the annals of American crime. They were a series of night slayings that were committed during a post-war age of jazz and newfound optimism that were both dark and terrifying. It is a chilling story of terror during a seemingly golden time of boom where a new America had emerged, but a night prowler was invading homes and creating nighttime carnage and chaos. The Axeman's modern status is one of mythological urban legend, and the rumors and theories behind this killer range from the interesting to the downright far-fetched, but terrifyingly the Axeman was real, very real. There were 4 people brutally murdered and 8 grievously injured by the Axeman. They were all New Orleans and the neighboring Gretna residents, predominantly Italian Americans, and they were attacked within their own bedrooms by a panel burglar. The weapon of choice usually belonged to the homeowner, and the attacks took place inside the homes of the people where this creature struck. The attacks occurred from May 1918 until October 1919, and now 101 years later they remain unsolved. There were unfounded reports of attacks going back to 1911, however these have subsequently been questioned by researchers. The letter sent by the Axeman claimed to spare anyone that was playing jazz, thus establishing the somewhat twisted and yet almost romantic motif that the Axeman was killing to promote his own love of jazz. The city of New Orleans was in the grip of fear by 1918. The attacks were surprising and vicious. The first victim, an Italian-American called Joseph Maggio, had his skull fractured and his throat cut with a razor, while his wife Catherine choked on her own blood. This clearly demonstrated the police description of a murderous degenerate who gloats over blood. In the spirit of a later serial killer known as the Night Stalker, and predating the infamous Richard Ramirez's trademark of breaking into houses in the middle of the night, this was the original Night Stalker. The Axeman had many of the same traits of Ramirez. He was a home invader with a desperate hate for women and a need to punish those as they remained the most vulnerable a human being could possibly be asleep. There is of course a strong possibility too that the attacks were a sexual compulsion. A letter to New Orleans, the Axeman's letter to the people of New Orleans. And on the night of March 19 the jazzman got his wish. The dancehalls were full and the majority of houses blared out jazz throughout the night and no murders occurred. However, it is impossible to distinguish if the above letter from the Axeman was real or a hoax in much the same way that we cannot identify the From Hell letters from Jack the Ripper. It is of course the most glamorized and famous aspect of the Axeman tale. The ghost of Clementine. Strangely enough, the unidentified Axeman was not even the first Axeman of New Orleans during that era. Clementine Barnabet was convicted in 1913 for a murder she carried out in 1911, whereby Clementine was a voodoo murderess with the same penchant for axe wielding as our jazzman. The only difference is that she was awaiting execution at the time of the 1918 slayings. Claiming, allegedly, up to 35 victims, she was described as braining her victims with an axe. Clementine is the stuff of an Anne Rice novel, true fantastical. I cannot believe it is true New Orleans lore. To have this coincide with the jazz-loving Axeman is even more crazy, and the overlap between the 1911 axe murder reporting and the 1918-1919 slayings could be explained by the presence of bloody Clementine. In 1923, Clementine walked out of prison and was never seen again. The first murder conclusively linked to the Axeman was on May 22, 1918, where store owner Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were discovered lying in pool of blood within their bedchamber. Joseph's brother, who was also a next-door neighbor, discovered the bodies. The killer had entered the house by chiseling a lower wooden panel out of the back door. The axe was left in the bathroom of the horror house, and the razor was found in the neighbor's garden. There was no evidence of stealing and thus no link to burglary as a motive. The only clue found at the scene was a cryptic message written in chalk on the pavement a short way away from the murder house. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." The police linked the message to Mrs. Tony Ambra, who was killed some 6 years earlier by an axe man. Again, experts cast doubt on whether any attacks prior to 1918 were carried out by the same man. However, this could link to a copycat slaying. Unfairly but beginning a running theme throughout the case, Joseph's brother was considered an early suspect in the murder. Andrew Maggio was booked in for questioning, but released when police failed to break down his statement. A month later, the Axeman struck again. On 27 June, baker John Zonka went to make a delivery to grocery store owner Louis Bessumer, another Italian-American. Zonka was aghast to discover the remains of Bessumer and what appeared to be his wife covered in blood, but somehow both were still alive. Bessumer had been hacked at with an axe. The attacker had again entered through a panel via the back door and attacked the seemingly married couple, while Louis Bessumer and wife Harriet lay sleeping. In a bizarre turn of events, it emerged that Harriet was not Mrs. Bessumer, but Louis Bessumer's mistress. Louis Bessumer had been attacked with his own axe, which again was found in the bathroom, and there were no valuables taken. The police rounded up suspects, including one of Louis Bessumer's employees, but a lack of evidence produced no further charges. Harriet was to die 2 months later as a result of her injuries. Harriet's final act before dying was to accuse Bessumer of espionage and working on behalf of the Germans, and pointed the finger at him for the attack. Louis Bessumer, rather unfairly, was even put on trial for the attack but was acquitted. The next victim was Mrs. Schneider, a non-Italian victim. Schneider was pregnant at the time and was discovered by her husband with her scalp cut open and her teeth knocked out. She had managed to survive the attack and would later safely give birth to her daughter. The survival of some victims, despite horrific injuries, would indicate a frenzied nature of attack rather than a methodical and pragmatic serial killer. The Axeman appeared to be attacking through methods of carnage and savagery. A FBI profiler would probably tell you that this indicates some form of rage and hatred towards women or Italian Americans. With Mrs. Schneider's attack, the windows and doors showed no signs of forced entry and, rather than an axe, a lamp was discovered near the scene and likely used in the attack. It kept in line with the victims being attacked by their own possessions. The next target after Mrs. Schneider was Joseph Romano. Romano was an elderly man who lived with his two nieces Pauline and Mary Bruno. The attack occurred on the 10th August 1918. The sisters had found Joseph after he had been struck on the head and was discovered bleeding badly. They managed to get a peek of the Axeman and described him as dark-skinned, heavised and wearing a dark suit with a slouched hat. The intruder had again used a chisel to the panels to force entry. Mr. Romano died 2 days after the attack resulting from the injuries. The attack to Joseph Romano sent the whole of New Orleans into frenzy and police believed that they were looking for a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Police detective John D'Antonio believed that they were looking for a seemingly normal person in plain sight with a dark and devious double persona. It was now that the idea of a mass murderer was taking shape. Serial killer was by then an unused term. The next attack was particularly disturbing. The Cortimiglia family were attacked by the Axeman on the 10th March 1919. This time the attack occurred in the New Orleans suburb of Gretna. For unknown reasons it occurred 7 months after the last attack, and there is no explanation into the hiatus. However, the MO remained eerily similar. They were Italian Americans and grocers. The Axeman had entered the house by chiseling through the back door panel and attacked with the victim's own axe. The Axeman had struck Charles Cortimiglia across the head, causing a fracture, and then turned his attention to his wife Rosie, who was holding their 2-year-old infant Mary. Little Mary would die instantly, with Charles and Rosie, despite their serious injuries, surviving the incident. It was fellow grocer Mr. Irlando Giordano that came to their aid when he heard the blood-curdling screams and then alerted the authorities. Unfortunately for Mr. Giordano, he was then accused by Rosie Cortimiglia of the murders. Making an accusation, which Rosie later admitted was made out of spite and jealousy, saw Irlando Giordano and his son Frank sentenced to life in prison and hanging respectively. Charles was allegedly so disgusted by his wife's actions and the false accusation, which he told police were untrue at the time, that he reportedly divorced her. With Rosie later recanting her testimony, the two men were then released and spared the multiple murder charges. It was after the Cortimiglia attack that the infamous letter was sent to the Times-Picayune newspaper, where the Axeman threatened an entire city, and the city rather surreally threw a massive jazz party to keep him at bay. The next attacks were questionable. The victims were Steve Boca and Sarah Lawman, who both managed to survive. However, the authenticity into these two incidents, being the Axeman, has always been questioned. The MO of attacking women matches Sarah Lawman, and Lawman also suffered severe skull fractures and had her teeth knocked out in the attack. However, this time the perpetrator had entered through an open window and not the chiseling of the panels. Steve Boca's attack was unusual in that there were no women present at the time of his attack, and despite surviving, he claimed to not remember anything from the attack. Many believe that these attacks were the work of a copycat, as they either did not follow the same MO or unusually attacked a single man in his bedchambers. The final slaying by the Axeman was on the 27th October 1919 against another Italian-American grocer called Mike Pepitone. Pepitone was awakened by a noise and was struck at his front door by an axe-wielding darkened figure. The figure then fled into the night unidentified by the Pepitone family. The blood from Pepitone's wounds had sprayed onto a painting of the Virgin Mary. In this instance, the nature of the attack and Pepitone catching them at the front door had fortunately spared both Pepitone's wife and his 6 children. And then after October 1919, the string of attacks just stopped. Who was the jazz-loving Axeman? The first theory points to the Italian-American mafia. Due to the attacks mainly being carried out on Italian-American grocers, it has led some to believe that it was the Black Hand that was behind the axe attacks. The Black Hand was an early form of the mafia in America and could link the murder to hardworking Italian-American business owners to an extortion racket run in New Orleans. This links the attacks to an old-fashioned vendetta in order to settle old scores and repay any outstanding arrears. Joseph Mumford is the only legitimate suspect linked to the real identity of the Axeman. Mumford was connected to the New Orleans extortion racket and was later shot dead by Mike Pepitton's widow in Los Angeles 1920. Further research has drawn a blank on this theory, as there is no record of a Mumford or Mumford having been in California, let alone dying in California during that time, and there is no source of a Mrs. Pepitton being arrested for any crime, which leads many to claim that the entire story is an urban legend. The story of Esther Pepitton avenging her husband's murder against an Italian mobster sounds almost too good to be true. And into the realm of fantasy theories, with many believing that the axe murders were the work of Clementine Barnabas copycat killers or a phantom that could appear in houses in the middle of the night and existed in a realm of fancy. Anne Rice-inspired ghost of the night that was attacking those as they slept vulnerably. This, of course, is a perfect explanation to blend into the Gothic history of New Orleans, but it is of course an idea of pure imagination. What are your thoughts and opinions into the existence of the near mythical and now fantastical true life story of the jazz-loving Axeman?
Number 3.
On Christmas Eve 1945, a mysterious incident took place in the Sodders' house. After Jenny and George Sodder, along with their 9 children, went to bed after a Christmas meal, a fire broke out. While the parents and 4 of the children managed to escape, it's believed 5 siblings died in the fire. But after a while, the couple began to notice signs indicating the missing kids could still be safe. What was it, the key to the mysterious fire, or just a desperate attempt by the grieving parents to find comfort in the delusion their sons and daughters were still alive? It was an ordinary Christmas Eve for a large American family. The Sodders gathered together in their family house in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Only the eldest son was missing. At the time, he was away in the army. 9 of his siblings were happily eating a meal prepared by their mother Jenny and looking forward to opening their Christmas presents in the morning. When it was time for the family to go to bed, 5 of the Sodder kids, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 6, asked their mother to let them stay up a bit later. Mrs. Sodder agreed, but reminded the children to turn out the lights and lock the door before going to bed. Sometime later, when half the family were asleep, the phone rang. Sleepy, Jenny went to the hall to answer it. The call left her puzzled. A female voice asked for someone who never lived in the house. After hanging up, Jenny realized the house was quiet, but the lights were still on, and the door had not been locked. Ms. Sodder knew her children pretty well, so she presumed they had forgotten her instructions and went back to bed without a second thought. At around 1:30 a.m. Mrs. Sodder heard a sound like something landing on the roof and then sliding down. Then, she could smell smoke. Jenny woke her husband, and they quickly left the bedroom, only to find the hallway filled with smoke and the stairs in flames. Jenny ran to the first floor to call the firefighters, but, to her great surprise, the landline phone cord was cut. So, they started to shout to get the children out of the house as quickly as possible. The family ran out of the burning house. But a head count after the narrow escape showed the 5 late sleepers were missing. George Sodder made desperate attempts to save the missing children from the house engulfed in flames, but none was successful. A ladder that always stood by a top-floor window was no longer there. Neither of George's 2 trucks started, so he couldn't move them closer to the house and use them as a ladder. All the few escapees could do was watch the fire tear down the house. The Sodders still couldn't get through to the firefighters. In less than an hour, the leaping flames turned their family house to ashes. The fire brigade didn't arrive until 8 a.m., hours after the flames were snuffed out. It turned out later that many local firefighters left their posts to spend Christmas with their families. The volunteers and newcomers in charge that night were not prepared to react quickly. Local police weren't eager to look into the case. After a cursory investigation, it was determined the 5 children were killed by the fire caused by faulty wiring. But the Sodders didn't accept the verdict. How could the wiring be faulty if it had been renewed not long before the incident? Why were several lights on and working perfectly during the fire? Why didn't they hear cries or groans of the 5 missing kids? Jenny and George asked for answers. The finger of suspicion. The Sodders were one of the most respected middle-class families in Fayetteville. The father, George Sodder, was born in Sardinia, Italy, and emigrated to the U.S. when he was 13. Jenny Cipriani, his future wife, also emigrated from Italy in her childhood. After their wedding, the couple settled near Fayetteville, which was home to a large Italian community. When they had kids, George owned a business that, according to the local officials, prospered. Meanwhile, the Sodder family had never really talked about why he had to emigrate. George Sodder had a sharp tongue. Besides, he had strong opinions on political issues and always felt free to express them boldly. In particular, his resentment toward Benito Mussolini led to some bitter disputes with some other immigrant community members. Thus, the family began to wonder if their father's boldness played Old Harry with them. Though Mussolini had already been taken down and executed by the time of the mysterious fire, George's critical remarks might have left a trace. In October 1945, a man came to the Sodders' house and persistently tried to sell them family insurance. After getting a categorical refusal, he warned George that his house will burn with smoke. And your children will be destroyed. You will pay for the dirty remarks you make about Mussolini. From vague suspicions to firm conclusions. Newly appearing facts soon backed up the Sodders' vague suspicions. First, no human remains were found at the fire scene, and no one actually could smell burning clay during the fire or afterwards. Ms. Sodder later learned from the local crematorium officials that it took at least 2 hours for a human skeleton to disintegrate in a fire. But the house burned for less than an hour. Furthermore, the temperature for such a quick disintegration had to be much higher than that of a burning house. Thus, if the children were in the house at the time of the fire, there should have been 5 skeletons in the rubble. Later, Jenny and George came across a bus driver who was sure he had seen something like fireballs flying onto the Sodders' roof. Might this have been the strange noise Jenny had heard in the middle of the night? Also, an acquaintance of the family claimed to have seen the 5 missing kids pass by in a strange car while the fire was still raging. A waitress at a diner 50 miles away from Fayetteville said she served breakfast to 5 children on Christmas morning 1945. She couldn't recall any details about the adults who accompanied them. Finally, a local woman said she had seen 4 of the missing Sodder kids at a South Carolina hotel. The tiny facts coming to light filled George and Jenny with hope and pushed them to dig deeper into the case. Attempting to find out what happened in their house that night, Jenny would burn chicken bones in an oven to see if they could be turned into ashes by fire in 45 minutes. The bones remained intact. Meanwhile, George found a story about a fire in another house that killed several people. The scene of the incident featured fully preserved skeletons among the ashes. Equipped with the facts they gathered, the couple returned to the local police and demanded further investigation. They were rebuffed, as there were no signs of a crime. The police had no grounds to reopen the case. So, the Sodders continued the investigation on their own. They hunted for information and photos, dug through the house debris, and spent time fathoming out what could have happened trying to solve the mystery. Once, digging through the ashes of the burned house, George Sodder found a few bones and something similar to internal organs remains. But lab tests proved the organ to be a cow's liver and showed the bones had not been exposed to fire. At some point, Jenny and George concluded their children were alive and had been kidnapped during the fire. The fire, the Sodders believed, had been started deliberately to cover the mysterious abduction. Thus, the hoping parents put a billboard next to the burned house site. The board had photos of the missing children on it and promised a reward for their safe return. The last glimmer of hope. In 1968, 23 years after the dramatic incident, Mrs. Sodder got an envelope from Kentucky with no return address. Inside the envelope, there was a photograph of a young man. The reverse of the photo featured the following words: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, I lol boys, A90132, or possibly A90135. Though the police would say it was a cruel joke, the Sodders were convinced a man in the photo looked exactly how Louis would have looked in adulthood. The couple hired a private investigator to track the mysterious sender in Kentucky, but the detective eagerly took the fee and never got in touch with the family again. The 1968 envelope was the last evidence the Sodders could find. George Sodder passed away the same year the family received the photo. His wife, Jenny, outlived him by 21 years. All this time, she wore only black clothes and continued the search. Despite the absence of new evidence, she never stopped to believe that her children were still alive. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest out of the 10 kids, is still alive. She is now 77 years old. Together with the Sodder grandchildren, she continues looking for her missing siblings. The Sodders remain convinced Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were kidnapped that day. So, they go on surfing through websites with information about missing people, peering into faces, and communicating with detectives interested in the case. The Sodders have never rebuilt the house, but instead turned it into a memorial garden for their missing children. In such a way, their story continues to live. And so does their hope.
Number 4.
It was the afternoon of February 7, 1983, and Gillespie, a school bus driver for the West Fall School District in Circleville, Ohio, had just dropped off one group of children and was headed to pick up another at Monroe Elementary School when she spotted the sign. It had been placed along her bus route at the intersection of Scioto Darby Road and 5 Points Pike. Gillespie parked the bus, exited, and approached the handwritten sign, which made an obscene remark about her young daughter, Tracy. Gillespie had been receiving such harassment for years, typically via letters in the mail, and she knew the sign was the work of the same anonymous perpetrator. In the letters, the person had warned her that messages would be posted publicly. Gillespie, annoyed, picked up the sign and the peculiar post used to hold it up, taking the entire setup back on the bus and going about her work. That evening, when she inspected the sign more closely, she opened a small container on the post. Inside was a .25 caliber handgun. Soon, Gillespie would learn that the person who had spent years harassing her had intended for her to rip the sign down in anger. And when she did, the gun was rigged to go off. With a current population of around 14,000 people, Circleville, Ohio, is not a place large enough to harbor many secrets. Roughly 25 miles south of Columbus, it's home to manufacturing companies, Ohio Christian University, and a water tower painted like a pumpkin. The town has a sense of neighborly intimacy, a closeness that the Circleville letter writer made a target of scorn. In the summer of 1976, Mary Gillespie received a letter postmarked in Columbus that had no signature and no return address. It asserted that Mary was having an affair with the West Fall School District Superintendent, Gordon Massey, and warned her to stop. "I know where you live," read one of the warnings. "I've been observing your house and know you have children. This is no joke. Please take it serious." Soon, her husband Ron began receiving letters too, demanding that he go to the school board with the information or risk being killed. Mary assured Ron the allegation was false. They decided to remain silent and hope the letter writer stopped. But the person didn't. Within weeks, more threats arrived, this time cautioning that if Mary didn't end the affair, it would be disclosed on CB radio and billboard ads. At that point, the Gillespies decided to disclose the harassment to their family. They told Karen, Ron's sister, and her husband Paul Fresher, an employee at a local Anheuser-Busch plant who was once a prison guard and had survived a harrowing 30-hour ordeal as a hostage when inmates briefly took over the Ohio State Penitentiary in August 1968. Speaking with the Freshers, Mary said that she had a suspect in mind, David Longberry, a bus driver who had once made a pass at her. Maybe, she thought, Longberry was feeling jilted and wanted to taunt her. It was agreed that Paul would write a letter to Longberry to demonstrate that the Gillespies knew what he was doing and to stop immediately. For a little while, the letters stopped. And then the signs appeared. To their dismay, Mary and Ron Gillespie began seeing signs posted around town that made claims that Gordon Massey, the superintendent, was romantically involved with the Gillespie's 12-year-old daughter, Tracy. Reportedly, Ron drove around town early in the morning to tear the signs down before Tracy could see them. The harassment campaign no doubt angered Ron. On August 19, 1977, he received a phone call at their home. The caller declared he was observing the Gillespie house and that he knew what Ron's truck looked like. Ron, furious, told his family he thought he recognized the caller's voice and raced out the door with the intention of confronting him. He brought along a gun. Moments later, a shot was fired. But no perpetrator was hurt. Instead, it was Ron Gillespie who lay dead behind the wheel of his truck. No one else was in sight. Authorities, including Pickaway County Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, failed to find any bullet casing on the scene. Ron Gillespie had been drinking. His blood alcohol content, BAC, was .16, twice the legal limit. Absent any hard evidence to the contrary, Radcliffe concluded that Ron had driven himself into a tree by accident. The relatives found that hard to accept, asserting that Ron wasn't known to be a heavy drinker. But police didn't seem convinced anyone else was to blame. Radcliffe told Paul Fresher that one person of interest, whom he didn't name, was questioned but had passed a polygraph test. Soon, more letters began arriving, this time to other residents in and around Circleville, that presented the idea Radcliffe was engaged in some kind of cover-up regarding Ron's death and that Mary and Gordon Massey were responsible for killing him. Ron's death wasn't the only change in Mary's life. Paul and Karen Fresher were divorcing, and Mary allowed Karen to move into a trailer on Mary's property. At some point after Ron's death, Mary also admitted that she had actually had an affair with Massey, but it had started after the letters began arriving, not before. It was a strange admission, but not quite as strange as what happened along her bus route on February 7, 1983. After Mary confiscated the booby-trapped sign that had seemingly been set up to fire the gun once she pulled the message down, Radcliffe and the authorities started trying to trace ownership of the firearm. The serial number had been filed off, but they were able to secure enough to identify who it belonged to. In doing so, it seemed assured that the owner of the weapon would also be the person behind the letters. The gun belonged to Paul Fresher. Both Mary Gillespie and the police were stumped. Why Fresher? Throughout the investigation, and on through his eventual criminal trial, no one could explain exactly what motivated Fresher to threaten his in-laws. And while Fresher maintained his innocence, the evidence against him was hard to ignore. After being released on $50,000 bond, Fresher voluntarily checked himself into the mental health center at Riverside Hospital because he wanted to be examined, possibly to help with a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. That plea was later dropped. Later, a co-worker at Anheuser-Busch named Wesley Wells testified that Fresher had purchased a gun from him for $35, while personnel records showed that Fresher had taken a day off from work on February 7, the same day Mary discovered the booby trap. Even more compelling was the fact that handwriting samples taken from Fresher's employment file were, according to handwriting experts, a match for 391 of the letters and 103 postcards sent to the Gillespies and other local residents. In total, over 1,000 letters had been sent across southern Ohio, many of them complaining of political corruption. Some contained arsenic. Fresher admitted he bought the gun, but didn't know what happened to it. He also said Radcliffe had simply asked him to try and copy samples of the offending letters, which resulted in a handwriting match. Fresher was indicted by a grand jury in March 1983 and set for trial in October 1983. It lasted 1 week. The jury needed just 2.5 hours to return a verdict of guilty on the charge of attempted murder using a firearm that was either in Fresher's possession or under his control. He was not formally charged with writing any of the letters, though 39 were admitted into evidence. Judge William Amer sentenced him to 7 to 25 years and an additional 3 years for controlling a firearm during the offense. The Circleville mystery didn't end there. Even as Fresher was imprisoned, sometimes even in solitary confinement, the letters continued to come to residents. Even Fresher received one, taunting him after a parole hearing had concluded without allowing him early release. "Now when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago, when we set 'em up, they stay set up." Don't you listen at all? Fresher was paroled in 1994 and continued to insist he had nothing to do with the letters. If he was guilty, his motivations for writing them remain puzzling. One theory is that he felt he was demonstrating loyalty to his wife, Karen, whose brother Ron may have known about Mary's affair, one Mary denied, took place until after Ron's death, and wanted to help both of them covertly put an end to it. But the Fresher marriage seemed strained. Divorce filings in Columbus included allegations made by Karen that Paul was physically abusive and prone to a violent temper. Perhaps Karen, spiteful over a divorce that ended with Paul receiving custody of their kids, wanted to frame him, though it's not clear why she would risk killing Mary Gillespie in the process. There was one lead that police were criticized for failing to follow up on. According to another bus driver working the day Mary discovered the booby trap, a yellow El Camino was parked at the intersection, and a man who looked nothing like Fresher was standing nearby, pretending to urinate. The man was never identified. Fresher died in 2012. No new evidence has come to light in the Circleville letters case. If it was Fresher, he certainly abandoned the practice once he received a prison sentence. If there were copycats or accomplices, they too stopped. The letters dried up by the early 1990s. In a 1978 article in the Dayton Daily News commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Ohio State Penitentiary riots, Fresher was asked if he suffered any lingering emotional damage from being held captive. He claimed he didn't, though said people often asked if he had become an alcoholic, saw a psychiatrist, or had any lasting effects. There was nothing wrong with Paul Fresher. Nothing he could point out. I still have nightmares every once in a while, Fresher said. I dream about what might have been and what was. But considering it all, I feel I am lucky that I am as well adjusted as I am, considering how close I came to death.
Number 5.
Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. Derek and Maria Broadus couldn't have been more excited to move into their dream house at 657 Boulevard in the well-to-do town of Westfield, New Jersey. But as the couple was preparing to settle into the $1.3 million house with their 3 children, they received this disturbing note in the mail. Signed only The Watcher, the letter had no return address. But whoever wrote it seemed to have been watching the Broaduses carefully. I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be, the letter continued. TSK, 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 bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. Even more disturbing, the Watcher noted the Broaduses' 3 children and asked if there were more on the way. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. And in the weeks that followed, these bizarre messages from the Watcher grew more and more threatening until the Broaduses backed out of the move altogether. Who was this so-called Westfield Watcher? While Derek Broadus maintains that an unhinged and dangerous neighbor might have sent the unsettling letters, others believe that the Broaduses may even have created the Watcher themselves. The Broadus family moves to Westfield. Before they bought what's now known as the Watcher House in 2014, the Broaduses were a fairly average suburban family. Maria Broadus had grown up in Westfield, New Jersey, just blocks away from the house at 657 Boulevard. Located about 45 minutes from New York City, the town of Westfield is a sleepy suburb where the biggest gossip before the Watcher came on the scene was the collapse of a local Trader Joe's roof. According to The Cut, residents viewed Westfield as a real-life Mayberry, the fictional small town that served as the backdrop to the Andy Griffith Show. The website Neighborhood Scout listed it as one of the top 30 safest communities in America in 2014, and as of 2019, it had a median household income of $159,923. But the affluent suburb has been the scene of other horrors in the past. In 1970, a man named John List infamously murdered his wife, mother, and 3 children in their Westfield home. But that horrifying crime had since become a distant memory, and most people in Westfield felt secure in their community. Derek Broadus, on the other hand, had grown up in Maine in a working-class family. But from his humble beginnings, he had worked his way up to a position as a senior vice president at a Manhattan insurance company. In June 2014, After Derek celebrated his 40th birthday, the couple closed on the 6-bedroom house at 657 Boulevard and began making renovations to move in with their 5, 8, and 10-year-old children. Then, the Watcher letters started. The Watcher sends their first letter to the Broaddus family. The first letter arrived at the Watcher house on a June evening. Derek Broaddus had been painting a few walls at his family's new home, and after finishing up, he checked the mail to discover a white card-sized envelope addressed in thick handwriting to the new owner. The typed letter started off with warm words of welcome, but soon devolved into bizarre and threatening passages that described how the author had watched the house for decades. They claimed that their father and grandfather before them had also watched the house at 657 Boulevard, which was built in 1905. "Do you know the history of the house?" the Watcher wrote. "Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out." The letter also said, "I asked the woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened," referring to the house's previous owners. The letter asked the children's names, saying, "Once I know their names I will call to them and draw them to sick me." Unsettled, Derek Broaddus called the Westfield police, who recommended moving any construction equipment outside the house in case the Watcher became emboldened enough to throw it through one of the home's windows. The police also advised Broaddus not to say anything to other neighbors yet, as they were now all suspects. The Broadduses next contacted the Woods family who had sold them the house. Andrea Woods confirmed getting an odd note signed The Watcher, but said she had dismissed it as harmless and thrown it away. She also said that she and her husband had lived in the house for 23 years and only ever heard from the Watcher once. But Derek and Maria Broaddus couldn't shake their fear that they were being watched. The Watcher letters continue. The second letter from the Watcher arrived 2 weeks after the first. This time, it was addressed to the Broadduses by name, and the author listed their 3 children by birth order and nickname. The Watcher mentioned an easel that one of their daughters had set up on a porch only visible from the side or rear of the house, asking, "Is she the artist in the family?" Additionally, the second letter made more oblique references to something hidden in the walls of the house and thanked the Broadduses for bringing more young blood. After getting a second letter, Derek and Maria began to feel panicked and edgy around all their new neighbors, who they saw as potential stalkers. They put their renovations on hold and stopped taking their kids to the house. A third letter arrived a couple of weeks later. "Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing you." The Broadduses investigate. Deeply troubled by the letters, the Broadduses continued to reach out to Westfield police. Detective Leonard Lugo led the investigation. For a time, Lugo suspected next-door neighbor Michael Langford, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, DNA found on one of the envelopes indicated that a woman had sealed them with her saliva, and the sample didn't match anyone in the Langford home. Furthermore, Michael Langford denied any involvement and his family backed him up, saying there was no way he would write such threatening notes. Desperate for answers, the Broadduses enlisted a slew of experts to investigate. Derek reached out to the real-life FBI agent who inspired the character of Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs, with whom he was on a school board of trustees. The Broadduses also tapped former FBI agent Robert Lenihan to do a threat assessment on the letters. His analysis showed that the writer was likely an older person based on vocabulary and their habit of double spacing after a period. Lenihan concluded that the letter writer didn't appear overtly threatening, but their obviously erratic thoughts could suggest unpredictability. They also hired the security firm Kroll to look for handwriting matches to the envelopes, but none emerged. Still determined to get answers, the family hired a forensic linguist and former member of the band Sean On, Robert Leonard, to scour local forums for language patterns that resembled the mysterious Watcher's notes. But all of these efforts came to nothing. Despite assembling an incredible investigative team, the Broadduses had no answers. At the end of the day, it came down to, "What are you willing to risk?" Maria Broaddus said. "We weren't going to put our kids in harm's way." The Broadduses decide to sell the Watcher house. Finally, 6 months after the first letter arrived, Derek and Maria put the house on the market, asking for a bit more than they had paid as they assumed their renovations would raise the value. However, after they disclosed the bizarre watcher letters to potential buyers, all offers fell through. Later in 2015, the Broadduses filed a suit against the Woods family for not disclosing to them the letter they had received from the watcher before the sale. But in 2017, a New Jersey judge threw out the suit, saying it could set an unreasonable precedent for what sellers would have to disclose. Meanwhile, some in the community began to wonder if the Broadduses weren't sending the letters to themselves in order to get out of a house that they couldn't afford. As one resident told Gothamist, "How can a couple with a $300,000 house in Scotch Plains and $175,000 mortgage 10 years ago have a $1.1 million mortgage?" In 2016, the Broadduses made a brief effort to have the house torn down and redevelop the lot. Their plans weren't approved, but a final letter from the watcher arrived, threatening to exact revenge on them if they harmed the house. Maybe a car accident. Maybe a fire. Maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. It went on to say, "You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, idiots." After years on the market, the Watcher house finally sold in 2019 with the Broadduses taking a $440,000 loss. And as for theories that the Broadduses faked the Watcher, Derek Broaddus flatly denies them. As he told The Cut, "This person attacked my family and where I'm from. If you do that, you get your ass beat." There is a silver lining for the family, however. According to Deadline, Netflix bought the rights to their creepy tale in 2019.
Number 6.
It's time to stop wondering who killed Tupac Shakur. America has spent the past 2 decades fishing at red herrings and inventing theories about how our brilliant brother could be gunned down on the Las Vegas Strip at age 25. The real answer is obvious, yet too many of us who love the culture avoid the facts. Tupac sealed his fate with one punch to a Crip's face. Heartbreak can teach powerful lessons. But instead of admitting that Tupac's genius was extinguished because he chose to play gangster, we continue to rationalize and glamorize his thug life, aided and abetted by a corrupt justice system that denies us much-needed closure. To prevent more Tupac tragedies, we need to understand what happened and why. On September 7, 1996, Tupac, Death Row Records kingpin Marion Suge Knight and Suge's gang of Bloods beat up a South Side Crip named Orlando Baby Lane Anderson in a Las Vegas casino lobby. Anderson and 3 other Crips went looking for payback. A few hours later, cruising the Vegas Strip in Anderson's rented white Cadillac, they saw Suge driving a BMW with Tupac in the front passenger seat. Anderson shot Tupac from the back seat of the Caddy. Ain't no skullduggery to it. Just a basic street arithmetic that continues to send thousands of black males to their graves. Anderson's beatdown was captured on security video. Suge's gangsters quickly spread the word that the killer was Anderson, according to what informants told police in the chaotic days after the shooting. Those anonymous sources were confirmed more than a decade later by the eyewitness account of Anderson's uncle, Southside Crip boss Duane Kef D. Davis, who says he was in the car and handed Anderson the murder weapon. Kef D's statements are detailed in the 2011 book Murder Rap by retired Los Angeles Police Department Detective Greg Kading. But thanks to internet-born conspiracies and institutional injustice toward black life, the question of who murked Pac has never been murkier. The new Tupac biopic, All A Is On Me, offers little clarity. Legend has enveloped Tupac's death like barnacles on a sunken ship. But if you scrape all that away, the machinery of Pac's demise was set in motion in July 1996 when a crew of Crips snatched a death row pendant from a blood named Trevin Trey Lane at Lakewood Mall near Compton, California, according to a Compton police affidavit. 2 months later, Trey Lane was with Tupac and Suge at a Mike Tyson fight in Las Vegas. After the heavyweight champ knocked out Bruce Seldon in the first round, the death row clique left the MGM Grand Arena and spotted Anderson in the lobby. Trey identified Anderson as one of the Crips who snatched his chain. Tupac rolled up on Anderson, rhetorically demanded, "You from the South?" and punched him in the face. Tupac, Suge and their gang proceeded to stomp Anderson out, right there in the MGM lobby. In the vacuum created by lack of closure, everything, no matter how far-fetched, seems somehow possible. These are indisputable facts, backed by witness testimony, police reports and videotape. I first saw them gathered in one place in the May 1997 issue of Vibe magazine, in a story by Rob Marriott. The report detailed how after Tupac's slaying, Bloods launched a full-out war on Compton Crips. Suge's henchmen told other Bloods that Tupac's killer was Kef D's nephew, according to the Compton police affidavit. When the bullets stopped flying, 13 gangsters had been shot, 3 fatally. There are no easy answers to the myriad questions surrounding Tupac's death, Marriott wrote after his harrowing experience reporting from the streets of gangland Compton. But it has become clear that the rap star's death and the 3 homicides that followed are only the most visible tragedies in a web of intrigue that extends deep into the LA underworld. That web was real. At the center was the tarantula Suge Knight, who, according to evidence detailed in Murder Rap and the book Labyrinth by Randall Sullivan, ran death row like a mafia boss. Suge's violence is well documented. He fueled a bicoastal beef with Sean Puffy Combs' Bad Boy Records and its superstar rapper Biggie Smalls, who was killed 6 months after Tupac. Suge had LAPD cops on his payroll, according to Labyrinth. On top of all that, shortly before his death Tupac argued with Suge over unpaid royalties, fired death row lawyer David Kenner, and planned to leave the label. Police, meanwhile, added to the confusion. Las Vegas cops told LAPD detective Russell Poole, according to Labyrinth, that the main reason they would never solve this case is that the politicians didn't want them to. They said the powers that be had let them know the city didn't need an OJ-style circus. Poole was investigating the Biggie killing. He said that LAPD brass, bracing for a lawsuit from Biggie's family, blocked him from following numerous leads that might have connected black LAPD cops to death row. Poole was ultimately removed from the case and resigned from the LAPD in 1999. Anderson denied killing Tupac and was never charged. In 1998, Anderson was shot dead outside a Compton car wash over what police there said was a drug debt. Anderson's killer is serving 3 life terms. In 2006, Kading, the LAPD detective, was assigned to reopen the Biggie Smalls homicide case. In Murder Rap, Kading says he and his team kept hearing about Kef D, Anderson's uncle, who saw Smalls at the Soul Train Music Awards after party hosted by Vibe magazine shortly before the Brooklyn rapper was killed. Kading set up a drug deal sting to coerce Kef D into talking about Biggie's murder. The trap worked. Kading writes that in December 2008, facing decades in prison, Kef D sat down to work out a deal but denied any knowledge of Smalls' killers. Instead, Kef D told them about Pac's death. Kading was in the room questioning Kef D. The interview was recorded. The gangster's story went like this: in 1991, when Kef D's Crip gang was selling dope nationwide, he was introduced to a Harlem drug dealer named Eric Zip Martin. They started doing business. 2 years later, Zip, who was involved in the music business, brought Kef D to a bet party at the Paradise Club in Los Angeles. At that party, Kef said Zip introduced him to Combs. Kef D said he maintained a relationship with Puffy, and he lent him the 1964 Chevy featured in Usher's Can You Get With It video. When the East-West beef jumped off, Kef D said his Crips provided security for Bad Boy on the West Coast. At one point, Kef D alleged Combs said he would pay $1 million for Pac and Suge to be killed. Kading quoted Kef D in Murder Rap as saying, "Puffy was like, I want to get rid of them dudes. I was like, man, we'll wipe their ass out, quick, it's nothing. Consider that done." Combs has adamantly denied soliciting any murder. Kef D told Kading that he went to Vegas simply to enjoy the Tyson fight and met up there with Zip, his nephew Baby Lane Anderson and other Crips. After the lobby rumble, when Kef De'd his nephew Anderson got stomped by death row, they immediately planned to retaliate. Zip gave Kef D a .40 caliber Glock. Kading wrote, Zip said it's perfect timing, Kefdi recounted, leaving the exact meaning of the words up to us. Was Zip talking about killing two birds with one stone, taking out Suge and Tupac as payback for the Baby Lane beating, and in the process collecting Puffy's $1 million bounty? It was impossible to know for sure. Trying to disprove these explanations is like arguing with someone who believes Barack Obama was born in Kenya. Kef D said that Zip departed after giving them the gun. Anderson, Kef D and two other Crips cruised the strip in Anderson's rented Cadillac and spotted Tupac's caravan. They pulled alongside the BMW driven by Suge Knight. Kef D was in the Cadillac's front passenger seat with the Glock, prepared to shoot, but Tupac and the BMW were on the opposite side of the caddy. Lane was like, "Give it here," Kef D said, and popped the dude. Kef D told Kading he never got a dime of Combs' promised payoff, although he thought Zip might have collected and not shared the loot. "If Puffy would have just given us half the money, I would have stayed strong," Kef said, explaining why he was telling on Combs. Combs has called all of this pure fiction and has said he never even used Crips as security. Kading knew he couldn't make a good legal case on the word of a criminal like Kef D. He tried to coerce Zip to corroborate the story and tell on Combs by setting up a sting with Kef D. But before the trap could be sprung, Kading's superiors removed him from the case in 2009. It was almost as if, in some surreal way, Poole was right all along, Kading wrote. The LAPD was trying to cover up the Biggie Smalls murder, not by protecting corrupt cops, but by undercutting the ability of its own investigators to make the case.
Number 7.
Over the past few millennia, the world's oceans have swallowed up tens of thousands of human beings and have occasioned an endless number of stories, legends and traditions, some factual, many fantastic. Among the legends are tales of ghost ships, vessels abandoned yet still under sail. The Mary Celeste is one of the enduring mysteries. On December 5, 1872, the merchant brigantine was discovered adrift and deserted some miles off the Azores in the eastern Atlantic. To this day, no one knows why. She was discovered by a Canadian freighter and was found disheveled but seaworthy and under partial sail. Her lifeboat was missing, and the last entry in her log was dated 10 days earlier. She had ample provisions and her cargo was intact, and the personal belongings of the crew and the captain were in place. A check of the records found that she had been built in Nova Scotia and launched under the name of Amazon by her British owners in 1861. In 1867, she was wrecked in a violent storm off Cape Breton and so badly damaged that she was abandoned. Sold for junk, she was bought by an American who spent more than $8,000 restoring it to seaworthiness. For the next few years, she sailed uneventfully on the coastal trade under the name of Mary Celeste. When she was boarded in 1872, she was carrying a load of denatured alcohol from New York City to Genoa, Italy. The salvage hearings at Gibraltar later in the year listened to all sorts of speculations about the Mary Celeste and her puzzling fate. Had she been hijacked by pirates? Had the crew organized a mutiny? Was there a conspiracy to carry out some sort of insurance fraud? Ironically, years later, the ship was deliberately wrecked in an attempt at insurance fraud, but none of his theories seemed to make sense. The Gibraltar hearings concluded without a finding as to the cause in 1874. 10 years later, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published a lurid account of the mystery that triggered a raft of speculations. Since then, the Mary Celeste has fascinated conspiracy buffs all over the world. Hollywood got into the game in the 1930s with a film starring Bela Lugosi as a homicidal, mutinous seaman who wreaked mayhem on the ship. When she left New York on that fateful voyage, she was captained by Benjamin Briggs of Wareham, Massachusetts. He was a skilled mariner. He took his young wife and their infant daughter along, perhaps in the expectation that they would enjoy a vacation in Italy. His journal entries show no anxiety or alarm. A letter to his mother a few days before embarkation said that our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage. 8 days after the Mary Celeste slipped anchor from Staten Island, another freighter, the Dei Gratia, captained by a friend of Briggs, embarked from Hoboken with a load of petroleum also destined for Genoa. At about 1 p.m. on December 4, 1872, Captain Morehouse on the Dei Gratia was told by his helmsman that a ship about 5 miles away seemed to be behaving erratically. Captain Morehouse noted that she had an odd set to her sails. Morehouse sent 2 seamen to investigate, and they found the scene that has baffled researchers ever since: a functioning ship with not a person aboard. Captain Briggs and family and his crew had vanished like clouds in the air. A lifeboat was missing, but things otherwise seemed to be in order. The ship was well provisioned, and her cargo was mostly intact, but her lifeboat was missing. A few years ago, the mystery caught the attention of Anne McGregor, a filmmaker who had done work for the National Geographic Society. She and her husband undertook a meticulous study of the episode and concluded that several hypotheses did not hold water, so to speak. The Mary Celeste had not run into a violent tsunami or tornado, nor was there any evidence that there had been a mutiny. Nor was it likely that the load of alcohol had exploded or been consumed by the crewmen and rendered them violent, as one theory surmised. Anne McGregor and her husband eventually produced a film documentary titled The True Story of Mary Celeste. They think that Captain Briggs, for some reason during heavy seas, ordered the ship abandoned. But as they concede, that is not the end of the story. The Mary Celeste sails on in the cloudy sea of myth and speculation,